Well, thank you, Daniel. It is so great to be back with Daniel. We are both associates of the Order of the Holy Cross. And one of the things I retired in 2016. I was Dean of Washington National Cathedral. My wife, Kathy, followed me around to 13 different jobs in the course of our married life. And the last one was in Washington, and we decided she's still there. And before that, I was a dean and president of Seabury-Western Theological Seminary, and I taught Anglican studies there, and I taught Anglican studies at Yale, at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, and Merton's been a long interest of mine. In 2015, right before I retired, it was the centennial of Merton's birth. He was born in 1915, and so I decided I was going to work up Thomas Merton that year, and I read basically everything I could by and about Thomas Merton. There was a great book that came out that year. You may have seen it, called We Are Already One, with essays by Joan Chittister and James Finley and all kinds of people, which is a very helpful introduction, and Richard Rohr, very helpful introduction to the life and work of Thomas Merton. And he's an interesting fellow. He was not raised in the church, and neither was I. I'm one of those people that, like him, got baptized as an adult. He was born in 1915. He graduated, I think, from Columbia in 1938, and that's when he got baptized. Then in 1941, he made his first visit to Gethsemane and decided to become a monk. In his earlier years, and being a Trappist monk, as you know, Trappist monks have a vow of silence. And Merton was in that for the first several years of his vocation. And then he wrote a book called The Seven-Story Mountain, which is his autobiography. It became a bestseller, and the order decided they needed him to start talking because it was basically his writing that supported the order. And if you've been to Gethsemane, I went to Gethsemane about 10 years ago, it's a great, the Roman Catholic Church, we Episcopalians tend to get there after everybody else. I once asked, when I was dean at Seabury, the Methodist Seminary was right across Sheridan Road, and they were right on Lake Michigan. And we were across the street, and we could see them, but they could see the lake. And I said to the president there, why do you guys always have so much better property than we do? And he says, because we get there first. Well, the Catholics, if you've ever been a church planter, the Catholics get to a community way before the Episcopalians do, and they buy up property. And they bought up a gigantic tract of property in Kentucky, about 50 miles south of Cincinnati. And in fact, they built this gigantic cathedral. I forget the name of the town, right next to Gethsemane. And Gethsemane is it's a monastery, but it's also like a gigantic farm. And when you go actually in their gift shop is like, Thomas Merton Enterprises Incorporated, They sell videos and audios of him. They sell mugs and swag and t-shirts and bumper stickers. And I brought back a couple of mugs, and I gave one mug to a couple friend of ours, and they fight about who's going to use it every morning, because they're big Merton fans. So anyway, if you ever go to Cincinnati or Louisville, be sure to go to Gethsemane and see the monastery where Merton lived. And you can actually go to his, they gave him, aside from the other brothers, they gave him a little house where he could work out there. And so you can see that place. It's really quite wonderful. I want to start, though, before we look at some of the handout, I want to start with reading something I should have put in the handout, and it's the beginning of a book of his called Confessions of a Guilty Bystander. So Merton had essentially what I would think of as like 5 different vocations. He was a Trappist monk. He was a writer. He was also a contemplative, and he actually was in charge of the novices for many years at Gethsemane. He was a social critic, very, very much opposed to the Vietnam War, very much in favor of civil rights and integration. and he was an ecumenist. I mean, he died in Bangkok, Thailand in 1968. He was electrocuted when a fan fell into his bathtub. But he was at a conference of worldwide contemplative monks from other traditions, not just other Christian traditions, but from other especially Buddhists and other world religions. And so Merton was one of the first sort of famous Christian writers to actually really be in contact with members of other religious traditions. And he wrote a lot about the interaction of Christianity and other traditions. But he, when you live out in Gethsemane, you're living basically out in the country, and you're only being with your other brothers in your monastery. And Merton had to go to Louisville to visit the doctor. And so he begins Confessions of a Guilty Bystander by saying, in Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. He's talking about the monastery there. The whole illusion of a separate holy existence is a dream. Not that I question the reality of my vocation or of my monastic life, but the conception of separation from the world that we have in the monastery too easily presents itself as a complete illusion. The illusion that by making vows we become different species of being, pseudo-angels, spiritual men, men of interior life, what have you. I'm not sure how his superiors at the monastery felt about that, but it's one of the great passages in Merton's writing, because he had this transcendent experience in the middle of a very mundane street corner in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, of feeling oneness with all of the people on the street around him. And so that his monastic vocation, the idea of separating himself and being like super holy, and really saw as an illusion, and he felt more called thereafter to be more a person. He had been a man of the world, very much a man of the world before his conversion, but then he was driven into this isolation, and then he went back to feeling more connected to the world. So he had a vocation where he actually, after those first 7 years of Trappist isolation, he was very much present teaching and leading retreats and conferences in and of the world. James Finley, who still lives in Los Angeles, who's a Roman Catholic priest and was a brother, was a novice when Merton was the novice master. Somebody asked James Finley if he was popular with the other brothers. And Finley thought for a moment and said, well, not really. And they said, well, why? He said, well, he had this habit of saying the truth to people. And he once said to the brothers, you all call yourselves contemplatives when you're really just introverts, which is not exactly winning friends and influencing people. Now, there is, as Daniel showed me this morning, there is another Merton scholar with my name, but if you ever run across a book by Gary Hall about Thomas Merton, I'm not that Gary Hall. There's also a Gary Hall who's an Olympic swimmer, and his son Gary Hall Jr. was an Olympic swimmer. I am neither of those people. But I'm just a guy who likes Merton and has a few things to say about him. Let's start with looking at this passage from New Seeds of Contemplation. So I told this story earlier to a couple of people, but when I worked at All Saints Pasadena for many years, for 11 years. I was there the last 5 years of George Regas, who was longtime rector, and the first 6 years of Ed Bacon, the next guy. And the day Ed Bacon started, they had a tradition at All Saints that the new rector starts the day the other one retires. So George Regas left August 30th, April 30th, 1995. Ed Bacon began May 1st, 1995. So his first day, he had the staff, met with the staff, and he talked about this book, New Seeds of Contemplation, how it was the book that was the most important book to him in his whole life. And I said, I've never read that book. So Fuller Seminary, which was right across the street, had a bookstore. And so when we had a break, I ran over to the bookstore to see if I can get a copy. And I saw all the other members of the staff trying to do the same thing. Well, I did read New Seeds of Contemplation. It's one of my favorite books. And this chapter, Things in Their Identity, has had a lot of influence on people. And I'm just going to read a passage. I'm not going to read this whole long passage. I'm going to read a little bit of it. But what about you? What about me? He says. Unlike animals and trees, it is not enough for us to be what our nature intends. It is not enough for us to be individual people. For us, holiness is more than humanity. If we are never anything but people, never anything but people, we will not be saints and we will not be able to offer to God the worship of our imitation, which is sanctity. In other words, if I'm really seeking true holiness, I have to offer who I actually am. I mean, one of the things you learn when you begin the life of prayer is that you start, as my mentor Harvey Guthrie used to say, you begin with this like cartoon of what a spiritual person is, right? That like I've got to be like St. Francis or somebody or Archbishop Sheen when I was young. You have to be this sort of pious cartoon of what a saint is. What Merton is saying, no, you don't need to offer a pious cartoon of yourself to God. You have to offer your actual self to God. You have to, but that takes some work. Joan Chittister, in her essay in this book, We're Already One, talks about that. She's a nun who is a wonderful contemporary spiritual writer. And she says, we live in a culture that so bombards us with images of masculinity, of femininity, of beauty, of success, that we adopt those images. We try to be those people, and we really don't know who we actually are. My other example of this is there's a great Jungian psychologist in Philadelphia who I heard speak a few times when Kathy and I were living there, one of our 13 places we lived, named James Hollis. And he has a wonderful book called From Misery to Meaning, about the midlife crisis. It's a great book, From Misery to Meaning. And Hollis, as a Jungian, his point is we all adopt a false self as children. I mean, you can't help it. Again, you've got peer pressure in school, you've got your teachers telling you to be, you've got your parents with their, was it the other thing Jung said, the hardest burden that parents ever place on a child is their unfulfilled dreams, right? So, I became a priest. My dad was an actor. I became a priest, and I learned long after I got ordained that my father didn't want to be a priest before he went into show business, right? And so, in other words, and I didn't know that consciously at all. But there's something about the way in which we as parents transmit all of this stuff to our children. And so the point of James Hollis is what the midlife crisis is that the false self works for a while. It probably works up until your 40s, right? You go to school, you get married, you have a kid, and then suddenly when you're 40, you're like, who am I? What am I doing here? And that's, some of us go out and buy red Corvettes. Some of us go out and do stupid things relationally that we shouldn't do. Some of us just get massively depressed and have to go into therapy. Well, what Hollis says is that midlife crisis, and Richard Rohr talks about this also, the midlife crisis is actually your opportunity to shed that false self and to discover who you actually are. And if you take the opportunity, and don't buy a red Corvette, and don't don't hook up with someone you ought not hook up with. If you actually take that opportunity, the second part of your life can be much more authentic and in touch with who you actually are. That's what Merton is saying in this first paragraph. It is true to say that for me, sanctity consists in being myself. And for you, your sanctity consists in being yourself. And that in the last analysis, your sanctity will never be mine and mine will never be yours, except in the communion, in the communism of charity and grace. Your sanctity will never be mine. My sanctity will never be yours, except in the communism of charity and grace. Our great English theologian, Richard Hooker, who was the great theologian at the end of the 16th century, who wrote a very long, wonderful book called The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Richard Hooker said that all of God's creatures participate with each other in helping each other achieve salvation. It's a wonderful idea that your particularity matters as my particularity matters. Again, if I'm just offering a cartoon of what an Episcopal priest is like, or what a husband is like, or what a friend is like, because it's something I've seen in a movie, or read in a book, or just inherited from the culture, I'm not doing anybody any favors. But if I actually do the work of discovering who I am, and it is a lot of work, because again, you've got to peel away all the stuff that parents and school and culture and other things have told you. If you do the work and you offer your authentic gifts to the world, the authentic gifts will actually collaborate in not only helping others reach salvation, but in building the kingdom of God. Frederick Buechner, the great Christian writer, some of you may have read once, said that vocation is where your gift meets the world's need. And the world has a need and you have a gift, but most of us walk around not really knowing what our gifts are because we've let someone else tell us who we should be and what we ought to do. And Merton is actually saying, no, you have to be who you are. For me, to be a saint means to be myself. Therefore, the problem of sanctity and salvation is in fact the problem of finding out who I am and discovering my true self. Trees and animals have no problem. God makes them what they are without any consulting. They are perfectly satisfied. With us, it is different. God leaves us free to be whatever we like. We can be ourselves or not as we please. I'll leave the rest of it for you to discover on your own, because it's a wonderful passage. But this idea, things in their identity, that you do have actually a unique identity. Your unique identity is what you bring not only to the church, but to the world and to the kingdom of God. And your first job before you do anything else is to live into that identity and let that identity and the gifts and all of the particularities of who you are as a person lead you into your life in the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I find this other thing from Faith and Violence. He wrote a book called Faith and Violence, and this passage at the bottom. So Merton was, for a Trappist monk contemplative living out in the farmland of northern Kentucky, Merton was extremely involved in the connections of the world. In the Vietnam War days, there was a group called Clergy and Laity Concerned that was formed. Reinhold Niebuhr, the Abraham Joshua Heschel, Merton, they were all part of this, raising their concerns about racial justice in America and about the Vietnam War. And in his book, Contemplation in a World of Action, Merton says there is that one of the problems of being a monk is that you buy into this idea that being a monk, you withdraw from the world, and that there's some sort of opposition between the contemplative life and the active life. Remember, if you ever hear every bad sermon I've ever heard about Mary and Martha, remember Martha is doing all the work and Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet, and well, every bad sermon I've had about that. I've never heard a good sermon about that passage, actually, but that's another story. But not even the ones I've given have been any good. But in people say, well, Martha's the active life and Mary's the contemplative life. Well, what Merton says, that's a false dichotomy. There is no difference between contemplation and action. A truly contemplative life that puts you in touch with God is going to drive you into dealing with, being present to others. One of the great Little Merton books I used to take when I would lead retreats is a book called, I think it's called, is it The Wisdom of the Desert? Do you have that book? It's a book of sections from the Desert Fathers, who were these, you think current day monastics are weird. I mean, these guys were really strange. They'd go out into the desert. The wilderness, you and I have grown up, like you all live in this fantastically beautiful part of the world, I have to say. I can understand why people have left where I live and come to live here, because it is really something. We are staying up in Trinidad, and it's just wonderful. To you and me in the 21st century, the wilderness is, we equate the wilderness with beauty and peace and serenity and contemplation. The wilderness in the ancient world was the opposite. The wilderness was a place of danger. The city was order. You'd have like a place like Jerusalem, you have the temple and the palace at the center of the city. The city is where order comes from. And if you imagine God at the center of the city, God's order is in the city, and the city is protected. It's got a wall around it. Outside the city is the wilderness, and you've got, wild beasts running around. There's no water. There's all kinds of just danger in life, and then other weird people walking around, marauders, highwaymen, that kind of stuff. Well, in the early church, a lot of contemplatives went out to the wilderness, not because they were Henry Thoreau going to Walden Pond, right? They went out to the wilderness because it was dangerous, because it was alien, because it was a place where they felt, was bereft of God's love and protection. And one of the things in one of the passages in Wisdom of the Desert, this guy said, one of the Desert Fathers says, if you have this beautiful gospel book that's really expensive, and a beggar in need comes to your cave, you need to sell the gospel book and feed the beggar, right? So again, that's, as Merton would say, contemplation and action are the same thing. You came out there to contemplate your gospel book, but the living reality of a person in need presented himself, and your job was to be present to that person in need rather than to the spiritual experience of reading your gospel book. And so contemplation and action are the same thing. And in the same way, and this is where we get to the next quote at the bottom of the first page, from his book Faith and Violence, what brought him out of his writing, praying, contemplative life, and he still lived that life, but what brought him out into the world was his concern that the monastic virtues compelled him to speak to social issues. So, the bottom of this page, the real moral issue of violence in the 20th century is obscured by archaic and mythical presuppositions. We tend to judge violence in terms of the individual, the messy, the physically disturbing, the personally frightening. The violence we want to see restrained is the violence of the hood waiting for us in the subway or the elevator. That is reasonable, but it tends to influence us too much. It makes us think that the problem of violence is limited to this very small scale, and makes us unable to appreciate that the far greater problem of the more abstract, more global, more organized presence of violence on a massive and corporate pattern, Violence today is white-collar violence, the systematically organized bureaucratic and technological destruction of man. Now, this is, the 60s he wrote this. He died in 68. This is long before the environmental crisis really became, topmost. I mean, people cared about clean air and clean water and the environment in the 60s, but the whole climate catastrophe was really something that it hadn't even dawned on people yet. And so Merton actually wants us to understand what our real challenges are. And he's one of those Christian thinkers that wants Christians to think about systems rather than about individuals. In other words, he wants us to sort of think about how we change the systems that oppress people rather than simply, handing out Thanksgiving baskets, rather than putting a Band-Aid on something. The real problem of hunger will be solved on Thanksgiving Day by giving a meal, but the real problem of hunger and of poverty will only be solved by systematic attention to injustice and oppression. And that is at the core of his thinking, and it's at the core of his monastic response to current issues. I want to look at one more passage in depth and then see if you have any observations, because I know there are Thomas Merton fans here. And again, I'm not an expert, but I am a fan. This is from his book, same book, Faith and Violence, Blessed Are the Meek. And I think this passage is really important for us in the current moment. And again, he was writing in the 60s, which were, as you remember, quite polarized over the war and over civil rights and over other issues. But the polarization of 1967 is nothing compared to the polarization of 2025. Christian nonviolence does not encourage or excuse hatred of a special class or nation or social group. It is not merely a this or that. In other words, the evangelical realism which is demanded of the Christian should make it impossible for him to generalize about the wicked against whom he takes up moral arms in a struggle for righteousness. The woke left, MAGA Republicans, right? We tend to think about people in large groups and abstractions. And Merton is saying the gospel will not let us do that. We cannot generalize about the wicked on either side. He will not let himself be persuaded that the adversary is totally wicked and therefore can be never reasonably or well-intentioned and hence never need be listened to. This attitude, which defeats the very purpose of non-violence, openness, communication, dialogue, often accounts for the fact that some acts of civil disobedience merely antagonize the adversary without making him willing to communicate it in any way whatever, except with bullets or missiles. Thomas à Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered, in Eliot's play Murder in the Cathedral, debated with himself, fearing that he might be seeking martyrdom merely in order to demonstrate his or her own righteousness and the king's injustice. This is the greatest treason, he says, to do the right thing for the wrong reason. For so as much as Merton was a social justice kind of Christian, he did not want to fall into the trap of demonizing people who disagreed with his social positions. His whole point is, again, if you think about things in their identity, your uniqueness is God's gift to you and to the world. The uniqueness of the person with whom you violently disagree is also that person's gift to God and to the world. And so if we demonize or caricature our adversary on either side, we are doing violence to that person's unique preciousness. And so again, the job for a Christian or person of faith from Merton is actually to get beyond demonizing our adversary, as tempting as in the social media age as it is to do that, but to get beyond demonizing the other person and actually attend to their uniqueness. One more, I want to refer to this this passage, the last passage, and then I'll just open it up. So this is from the Asian Journals of Thomas Merton, which was a book he died in. It's a wonderful book, too, because Merton was an amateur photographer. And it's full of these, he went to these gigantic, like Buddhas in Sri Lanka and took pictures of them. And he just wrote this diary. And he was at this monastic conference of worldwide monastics from all the traditions. And he talks about this guy, Chungyeon Trungpa, who some of you may have known. He's actually a large figure, not today. He was until recently. I think he died. He's a large figure in international Tibetan Buddhism, especially in the United States. And he tells this story of about a Tibetan Lama who was faced with the decision of leaving his country. This is Chungyeon Trungpa. He did not quite know what to do. He was absent from his monastery on a visitation to some other monastery, and he was caught out in the mountains somewhere and was living in a peasant's house. You remember that all the Tibetan monks have been kicked out of Tibet by the Chinese, and the Dalai Lama lives in exile in northern India. And he was wondering what to do next. He sent a message to a nearby abbot friend of his saying, "What do we do?" The abbot sent back a strange message, which I think is very significant. "From now on, brother, everybody stands on his own feet." And that's what he says at the end, the last paragraph of the page here. This is what Buddhism is about, is what Christianity is about, is what monasticism is about. It is not a Pelagian statement, justification by works, but a statement to the effect that we can no longer rely on being supported by structures that may be destroyed at any moment by a political power or a political force. You cannot rely on structures. The time for relying on structures has disappeared. They are good and they should help us, and we should do the best that we can with them, but they may be taken away, and if everything is taken away, what do you do next? So those of us that live in the contemporary church, I'm in Los Angeles. I'm involved in the work of our 38 mission congregations. We have 140 congregations in Los Angeles, 38 of them are missions. We have a lot of congregations that are facing, like you said the prayer this morning for the church to close. We have a lot of churches that are facing some sort of radically different future. Probably not closing all of them, but some of them will have to merge, some of them will have to find another way to do ministry in their communities. And it seems to me, those of us that have relied, those of us clergy certainly, who have relied on the church as a structure, that will always be here and will always be robust, we realize the fragility of the church as an institution. And we need to understand that we're in a world where the kind of realities that we always depended on as solid and stable, like nature being friendly, like the church being stable, like the political discourse being rational, those structures no longer exist. And so part of the task of the spiritual life, according to Merton at the very end of his life, is getting ready to figure out how you live in a world where you have to stand on your own feet. And he doesn't mean that in a scary way, but to say again, with his trust in our gifts and his trust in our God-given identity, what he's saying is we need to find a way to trust that we have the resources to be who God wants us to be in the world we have. I don't need my college to give me my identity. I don't need my job to give me identity. I don't need my political party to give me my identity or my hobby. I mean, I have my identity, and I can live happily and healthily in the world without, if the structures are still there to support it, fine, but if they're not, I'm going to be okay. It's very much what Jesus, I think, is saying in today's gospel about the destruction of the temple. Don't worry about what you'll hear this great and more boring length at 10:30, but don't worry about the calamities that may be coming your way, because if you're true to who you are and who God calls you to be as a person and as a church, you will have the resources to meet those calamities. I don't mean to say, I have never liked the phrase when somebody says God never gives you more than you can handle. I hate it when people say that to people, because I've seen God routinely give things to people that they cannot handle. So I'm not saying that in a kind of blithe way. What I am saying, though, is that in some way, that people like Thomas Merton help me understand God is with us even in those calamities. That we discover God's presence. It's not that the calamities aren't going to happen, but that we will find God's sustaining presence in and among them. We may not handle them all nicely, but we will be able to be in them and to have a life after them because of the sustaining, loving God who called us to be who we are, who made us as we are, and who invites us to live together with real respect and celebration of each other's uniqueness. So I could say more about Thomas Merton, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts or observations or questions or comments or complaints.
Thank you.
It's a conversation stopper, I know.
Well, one thing you said earlier on about sort of systemic sin, how Merton calls our attention to that.
Right.
Sin is systemic and not just individual. I think that helps me understand this this call to stand on our own 2 feet and not always rely on structures. Structures are helpful, and yet it seems also that some structures have a tendency to fall into some systemic sin by I'm trying to think of examples, but I mean, political parties, it's a system, it's a structure.
Well, just think of the church itself.
Exactly,
I mean,
right.
Reformations. And it's interesting, when you do the baptismal service, you renounce, we think of sin as, I ate fish on Friday, or something. In my childhood, that's all my Catholic friends. I always wondered what happened with people who went to hell because they ate fish on Friday and then the Pope changed the policy. Did they get sprung out or what? But when you renounce evil, you first of all renounce Satan and all his works. So you renounce cosmic evil, and then you renounce the structure, the system, the structures that oppress the children of God.
Should look at that.
And then you turn from sin, and so you reject cosmic evil first, then you reject societal evil, and then you renounce your own sinfulness.
Yeah, all the forces of evil, right? Yeah.
That rebel and resist God. Right, yeah. So that oppressed. So in other words, we tend to think of sin as I've done something wrong. Well, I have, but there's my great example so here I'm wearing a shirt, right? And I think if I go to church, I said the confession, I got absolved. So I'm a relatively clean person, at least until I get back on the freeway, right? But I'm wearing a shirt. This shirt, even though it's a clergy shirt, I'm sure was made in a sweatshop. So we are enmeshed in sin. Even if we try to be personally righteous, we are enmeshed in structures that are sin. And that's what Merton is saying. So if you want to talk about sinfulness and violence, yes, talk about the mugger on the street and talk about the, whatever criminal you think of. But also, it's not that simple, because to be social people means as he says somewhere, nobody has clean hands. We all have dirty hands. And the issue is, how do we come to terms with that? Not to beat ourselves up about it, but to understand that it's like when you do anti-racism training, you talk about racism. Again, we think, well, I'm not a racist. He doesn't have a racist bone in his body. Yeah, but there's structural racism, there's societal racism, there's institutional racism. So, I don't think of myself as a racist, but I'm part of a church that built a lot of its endowments on slave labor. A lot of East Coast churches and Southern churches were built with slave labor. A lot of our endowments came from people who were owned slaves. So the church, even as holy as the Episcopal Church is, it still is enmeshed in the economic system, which is unjust and oppressive, even when we try to reform it. even when you try to reform a system like a church or a, I don't know if you found the stories that have been big in the Washington Post, the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in North America, or it's another, he's been suspended on sexual misconduct and financial charges. Now, this is a denomination that started about 15 minutes ago, right? They broke away from us because we were so awful, you know? And now their Archbishop is being tried for misconduct. I mean, we do have, I did clergy sexual misconduct work back in the 90s for the Diocese of LA. We do have problems of clergy doing bad things and lay leaders doing bad things. I mean, so all systems, even with the best intentions, all systems become compromised in some way. And so there always needs to be a, but Merton's point, and the point of the church is, that's why we need to analyze ourselves, confess, repent, and move on. So it's not like we're ever going to get to some resting place of absolute, pure, perfect holiness. To be human in the world is to be involved in sin, and that's who we are. We can't help ourselves, but we do our best to account for ourselves and then figure out how to live abundantly with each other. Yes?
So, your comments about Mary and Martha and other things, active versus contemplative, it comes to archetypes. There's so many binary archetypes in our society that we want to see things one or the other.
Right.
The real answer is it's almost always both, male, female.
Right.
You know, good or evil.
Right.
Or contemplative or active. I mean, everything. I come from a quantum physics background, and so you know, is it
Particle and wave. Yeah.
Is it a particle or a wave? Right. And the answer is both.
Left and right, too.
Right.
Well, and that's actually, I didn't, in a Joan Chittister essay in that book, she talks a lot about Merton's love of paradox. And again, I think, I think the problem, I mean, actually it's one of the great things about Anglicanism, is that we are a tradition that achieved its formative identity under Queen Elizabeth, where you had, you know, Henry was a Catholic and then he left, and then Mary, then Edward, his son, was under the guidance of a big radical Protestant, and then Mary, his daughter, became Catholic and she became queen and she was Catholic, so there were persecutions on both sides. And when Elizabeth became queen, the settlement that she brokered, and it's really, she's the founder of the Church of England, I would say, more than Henry, that was, you know, we would have Catholic and Protestant in the same tradition. You know, unity in all, you know, in things essential, we would have unity. In things indifferent, we would have diversity. And so we have a tradition that has always understood there's a Catholic side of our tradition and a Protestant side of our tradition. And we stand in the middle, not indecisive, but understanding that there's truth in both sides. And I think that, I always keep saying, and people in my generation keep saying, that's going to make us the church of the future, because people are going to understand that that's really important. But you're right. I mean, our very tradition embodies both sides. And one of the sad things to me, and I say this as a lifelong progressive and a big advocate of ordination of women and same-sex marriage and everything else, is that a lot of conservatives have left the Episcopal Church because they think of us as the woke left, you know, a prayer. And that's not really true, but I think we've got some work to do as a denomination to really, again, not demonize people that don't agree with all of our social stances. And I think we've lost something important in terms of our political diversity, and I'm hoping in the next generations we can find a way to recover it. Not that I want to retreat from any of our positions about justice, economic justice, or sexual orientation justice, or racial justice, but I think we need to find a way to affirm those things in a way that doesn't demonize people on the other side. There were other people over here too. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment, the little gem that's sticking out for me from what you've said was about castigating the other as the demon, the wicked, the wrong, and trying to shed the false self, the goal of shedding this false self to be more present with God. And it seems like each time we castigate somebody as the demon, we're also creating this structure of ourselves as the righteous good.
Right.
And they're both walls and barriers, and the gift of being on 14th Street in Lexington was just being part of the goodness, the true goodness that's present in it all. You know, you have to, if you can let go of seeing the demon in them, you can start to see the flaws in yourself that need to be let go of.
Right.
So anyway, I just wanted to comment.
And
on
it's
that.
constant,
It's really
ongoing.
touched me.
I thank you for that. And it's constant, ongoing work.
Oh, it's.
You know?
I mean, I suppose it can be this big burst of enlightenment, but I think it rather is a little chipping away of the mortar and the cement. That's.
Well, and if you're one of the things that people don't understand about monastic life is it's extreme. It's not at all restful and relaxing because you're in an intense community with other people. I've been associated with Holy Cross for a long time. When they had a house in Santa Barbara, my spiritual director was there, and he once told me they had a shrink they worked with who met with them once a week to talk about how they navigated all their interpersonal conflicts in the monastery. So we go to monasteries and say, "Oh, isn't this restful?" You know, but they are like they live in this intense thing, and so Merton as a monk realizes the minute you come and you have that great experience, in Louisville, and you have this awesome. You come back to the monastery, and there's the guy that cracks his knuckles sitting next to you, right? And you've got to deal with the reality of him as. So in other words, it's never done. I'm doing a quiet day at the House of the Redeemer in December on 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot, which is his poems he wrote before and during World War II. And he has this quote. He says that he realizes that he's thinking about heaven and hell, and that heaven would be hell for an unreligious person. You know, so you think about like, wow, that's a mind blower. You know, like if I'm a totally non-believing person going to heaven with all everybody singing with harps and everything, oh my God, that would be a nightmare, right? So it's all relative. Was there a
Couple more questions. We have time for.
Yes.
I'm reading a book called Thomas Merton, The Noonday Demon. Are you familiar with that? It's a collection of letters I guess he wrote to the superior in Italy when he wanted to transfer to
Camaldoli.
Yeah. And they're his letters and the responses, and it's about his trying to find meaning in his life, and he was irritated with all the noise at the Gethsemane monastery, and he wanted to go to a place that he thought was truly contemplative. So I wondered how that fit with his changing his outlook, because there was a time apparently that he really sought to be a contemplative without action in the world, or at least.
Yeah, I think in his early days, in his Trappist period, he was quite devoted to silence and all that. And then he got called both the Louisville experience, but also then his feeling the need to speak to social issues, and the order's need for him to write and speak so they could have the income from his work, which is that's Joan Chittister's same situation in Erie too, that she just can't ever retire because the order that's the only way the order survives is with her writing. So I'm sure all the things drew him into that, but you can see it. But that's when they gave him that. It's not a hermit. What is it? It's a
Hermitage.
It's a hermitage.
That's, he wants to be a hermit,
I
because
think
Camaldoli's
that's
are
probably
hermits.
what happened, because his superior would not let him go.
Right.
Yeah, he made a vow. to
And
follow.
But then he had a hermitage on
And
the.
then they made it possible.
But he was always sort of discontent. When he was at the Hermitage, Joan Baez would come and visit him at the Hermitage and have picnics. And he was very social, but whenever he was socializing, he was like, I got to go back to the Hermitage. When he was at the Hermitage, he kind of wanted to get out. He was honest
He was
with that.
struggling with his identity or
But they accommodated him very much.
I have not been to New Camaldoli and Big Sur,
Oh, you gotta go.
but there's a Roman Catholic, and they're actually partners with the OHC.
Yeah. that's right.
But that's up above Big Sur. There's a New Camaldoli monastery. One of my friends, one of my brother friends, actually lived there for like 5 years as a hermit at New Camaldoli, and he loved it. So it's a whole different style of spirituality. Again, I love that saying. You know, you're not a contemplative. You're an introvert. You know, and whether you're actually want to be by yourself just because you don't want to see it, you're not Greta Garbo, you know, or you want to be by yourself because you want to go. That's the question.
Yeah.
You know.
We have time for one more question. Was that Paul? Pastor Paul?
Yeah.
Question. I want to thank you so much for coming. I left Merton in my seminary days because he didn't make sense to me. I went over to Henri Nouwen
Oh yeah.
and C.S. Lewis because they made much more sense to me, and I identified much more with them at the time. But Merton never made sense, and you have helped me so much this morning. I went to one of my seminary professors, and I told him I want to study more about systemic evil. And he said there's no such thing. It all comes down to the individual.
Huh.
What do you do? What will you do because of this? How will you respond in the face of this? It is up to you
Wow.
to make the difference. But this has been very helpful to me.
Yeah. I think again it's back to the paradox. Two things are true at the same time. What I do, my decisions actually matter and have consequences, right? As a moral agent,
Yes.
I have to believe that, and I have to realize that part of what goes into my makeup is my context, and my context also. So I'm predisposed to sin because of my context, right? And even if there's no way. Again, we all have dirty hands. Even people that make great ethical decisions are subject to the context they're in. So I would say, yes, you're as a moral decision maker, you know, your decisions matter. And so this is not to blame my culture for my failings, but to say that my culture has a lot to do with my enmeshment in the system of sin. That's kind of what I'm saying. Again, the shirt problem. This shirt is a product of sweat labor and unfair labor practices, whether I have clean hands or not.
And the whole context of it.
Right.
You know, Bernard of Clairvaux,
Right.
this beloved saint who began the monastic movement, at the same time started the Knights Templar
Right.
to go off and slay
Right.
the Islamists.
What is it? Fireside Theater said we're all bozos on this bus.
Yeah.
And on that note,
Thanks, everybody.